All right, everybody, we're ready to pick up Zechariah again. Is he getting heavy? You get toward the end of the book, Zechariah's gaining weight. He gets heavier to carry. The book's gets more messianic and different ways to understand certain phrases and things and verses. But I think we can figure it out. If we can get through chapter 11 last week, we can handle 12, 13, and 14. Chapter 11, what'd you think when we got through with it? About the two rods and the names. The rods had names and they got broken, and we had shepherds being rejected, and we had Zechariah acting like a good shepherd, and then we had the wicked shepherds being talked about, and it's somewhat vague in its construct, literally, that it opens the door up for some various understandings, but I think we came close to what it meant. But I'll leave that in y'all's hands to contemplate. And so at the end of chapter 12, or I'm sorry, at the end of chapter 11, we've set the stage now for Jesus to come. He's introduced that major thing in chapter 11. And really what chapter 11 boiled down to was, tell us more about the Messiah. Tell us more about the Messiah. We want to know more about this coming King Shepherd. I'm not sure you're going to like this message, but here's a little more information for you. He's coming, and your descendants are going to reject him. And here's the consequences. You mean all this work we just did to rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem, and our descendants are going to reject the shepherd king so that all of this will be destroyed? All our work will be destroyed? Yes. Yes. Physically. But what Zechariah is going to try to do in the last part of this book is try to impress upon the people, if you focus upon the literal here of the physical temple and the literal physical Jerusalem, you've missed the point of the purpose of the coming shepherd king. The point of the coming shepherd king, for which you should be glad and looking for that day, is the spiritual kingdom he's coming to build that will never pass away. And you will have first crack at being its first citizens. And that should put a smile on your face for your descendants. What happens to this city shouldn't matter. But that's still hard to take, isn't it, when you spend your whole life? And, you know, Joni and I live out the other side of Keswick. And you know all those horse farms that are out there that have been there since 1710, established 1720, 50 years before Thomas Jefferson was even born at Shadwell. These farms existed. And you know what's kind of interesting about those farms? That they just seemingly never change. The fences get repainted every 4 or 5 years. The paddocks are all the same. The barns get a new roof once in a while. And then about every 20 years, you see a for sale sign from one of these luxury real estate agencies, post a big sign out by Route 22 on Gordonsville Road, Louisa Road. And it'll stay out there for a little while, and somebody will buy that big plantation farm. And somebody will live there about 20 years or so, and you'll see that sign come up again. And somebody else will buy that farm and live there for about 20 years. And what's happening is people make money in this world. They want to have privacy. They want to have a big place. They might be interested in horses, or now the biggest thing is vineyards. But, that'll change. When the taxes change about vineyards, that'll go away and cows will come back. But, maybe they're into cattle and they want a cow-calf operation, and you'll see that change. Maybe they just want to grow grass. But they'll change what's going on that property, but rarely will you see now that property subdivided. But what's happening is the people that buy that, they put all their investment in it, they make this their forever home, and it's all luxurious. and then they get too old to take care of it. And their kids, most of those used to be horse farms. You know, when you raise horses, it's a lot of work. Okay. And kids today are not interested in that. They're interested in video games and drones. Right? Things they can play with. ATVs. They don't want a horse, they want an ATV. I get it. Things change. But that generation changes, and the kids don't want that big house. They look at it as a burden. They don't receive all the effort that went into creating such a special, beautiful place. And so the parents wind up having to put it on the market. And somebody else, who in the meantime has gone out and made a lot of money, they're looking for a forever home. They're looking for privacy and space, will come along and go, oh, this is the perfect place, and they'll buy it. And they'll raise their kids, and then their kids won't want the place, and they wind up selling it to somebody else that has that dream. And it's a cycle continually on that property out there. And I like it because it keeps the places looking nice, and there's no subdivisions going in, and it looks the same as it did in 1850, probably out there up and down that road. But future generations don't always put the same preciousness to the founders of what they had an idea for their family to do with that property. They go another way with it. Maybe that's what's happening with Jerusalem and the temple with these people here. That the remnant put in all that effort and that work and volunteered to leave the comfort of their homes in Persia that they had made for themselves with businesses, and came back to Jerusalem to put all this together. And in the centuries to follow, the people just kind of forgot about all that. They didn't have to endure that. And so they don't appreciate it. It was just kind of given to them. They didn't have to rebuild the temple every generation. It was there. And so perhaps that's part of it. But Zechariah is trying to get them to see the emphasis then is on this spiritual kingdom that this shepherd king is going to build. The stage is set for the Messiah to come. We saw in chapter 11 as well that the physical Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. It's not going to be protected anymore. We talked about those rods or those staves and with their names of union, right? And what's the other one? Yeah. They were broken. That represented the covenants of God with the Jewish people. God was not going to protect the Jewish people any longer as uniquely his, as he had promised from the time of Abraham. And that sets the stage for my understanding of chapter 11, that much of this destruction is finally taken care of in once they reject the shepherd king and the Jesus Christ in 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem. Because God's staying of the hand against the nations, against physical Israel, has been removed. And I keep thinking of that phrase. Several chapters back we read it, and I saw it with my own eyes. Zechariah says on behalf of God. Shepherd king saw their wickedness with his own eyes. Jesus Christ came and saw and was rejected with his own eyes. Kind of like that parable of the vineyard where the owner sends, servants to see about the vineyard, and the people working in the vineyard kill all the messengers. He finally says, I'll send my only son. They'll listen to him. And so his only son goes. And what do they do to the only son? They killed him too. They killed the shepherd king. He has seen it with his own eyes. And so it's a powerful thing to contemplate of what Zechariah has in store for them in 11. And so when we get into 12 now, there in this chapter, when we read through 12, you're going to see a phrase repeated several times. And that phrase is in that day, or at least in my translations, it's in that day. And it's in, just very quickly, it's in verse 3, it's in verse 4, it's in verse 6, it's in verse 8, it's in verse 9, it's in verse 11. It's also in chapter 13, verse 1 and verse 2, verse 4, in chapter 13, in that day. So I guess if we're going to understand chapter 12 and chapter 13, it'd be really good if we figure out when is that in that day talking about. Because if you get that wrong, you kind of have a hard time understanding the rest of it, don't you? So when is this in that day? Well, we got clues here. This is described in verse 2. Behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the people around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will be also against Judah. And it will come about in that day. So in that day is what? It's when the siege of Jerusalem is happening. This staying of the hand of God that he has covenanted with them to protect them against all the other nations has been removed because they have rejected his son. And so he just stands out of the way and lets nature, so to speak, take its course in the nation, among the nations of men. And in 70 AD, the Jews had really stepped in the middle of a mess with the Romans. Now, they've stepped in the middle of messes with other nations that were more powerful than them around them all through time, haven't they? All through time, they have made messes for themselves with other nations that were more powerful than them. Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, even some of the other nations that are mentioned in the prophecies we've looked at times could have dominated Israel. But why didn't they? The angel of the Lord would appear and slay 185,000 men of the other army in one night. That's the protection that God is no longer giving them. And so when they step in it in the late 50s to about AD 65 or so with the Romans, they seek to have a rebellion and rebel against Rome. Okay, this is after Christ has died. They try to push Rome out of Palestine, and they make some alliances in a period of time where Rome was for a while a little weak, had some weak Caesars. They were distracted in other places, such as Britain. And they turn their eye away from Palestine for a while. And the Jews try to take advantage of that. Rome turns its head right around and sees that. And in 70 AD, they deal with the final solution toward the Jews in Israel. And Vespasian and his son Titus come in, and they wipe that city off the map. They scrape, it says they scraped it clean. And then the abomination of desolation is referred to in Zechariah here again. It's been referred to in other places. And what is that desolation, abomination of desolation? What does that refer to? It happened before the Romans. Pete?
Well, it was a sacrifice that did on the
Yes, that's it.
put the pig or whatever it was on.
He sacrificed unclean animals and set up a pagan altar inside the temple of God. Didn't, yeah. And that's described as the abomination of desolation. And so Zechariah is saying in the day of this siege of Jerusalem, you're going to see the abomination of desolation. And when you see it, what do you need to do? Members of the new spiritual Israel, run, flee, right? Flee. When you see that happen, and guess what? When the Romans conquered and finally entered Jerusalem, what did they do in the temple? They offered sacrifices to their gods, and they offered unclean sacrifices there. And so it happens, and it's going to happen again, this abomination of desolation. And so this is what's under consideration now in chapter 12. But let's look at how it's broken down in 12 and look through these verses. Verses 1 through 4 talks about the protection of spiritual Jerusalem in the day of siege. Is spiritual Jerusalem going to be protected? Not physical, but what about this new kingdom that's going to be established by Christ? Comes as a small rock, grows into the mountain that topples Nebuchadnezzar's statue in Daniel chapter 2. Well, Jerusalem, I'm going to make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will be severely injured. It's going to be hard to take Jerusalem, and the Romans sure paid a price for that. It took them years to do it. In that day, declares the Lord in verse 4, I will strike every horse with bewilderment as rider with madness, but I will watch over the house of Judah while I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. Now, this house of Judah here, folks, this is not the tribe of Judah from physical Israel. He's describing this new kingdom. Okay. If we can say New Jerusalem, new kingdom, we can certainly say New Judah, new house of Judah. And he's going to he's going to protect them. He's going to watch over them. The clans of Judah will say in their hearts, a strong support for us are the inhabitants of Jerusalem through the Lord of our hosts, their God. All right. So he's going to protect spiritual Jerusalem in this day. In verses 5 and 6, there's going to be an empowering of the spiritual Jerusalem. And we're going to see that spiritual Jerusalem receiving means to care for themselves. And this church, this new kingdom is going to grow. They will consume on the right hand and on the left all the surrounding peoples, while the inhabitants of Jerusalem, again, dwell in their own sites in Jerusalem. What's going to happen among the early church? They're going to grow. They're going to assimilate. People are going to turn and join them from the surrounding peoples. That reminds you of a verse anywhere? How was the church going to start? In Jerusalem,
No.
Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. This is kind of another, which Zechariah is saying that in a slightly different way. I believe here in verse 6. And look at verse 7. The glory of spiritual Jerusalem in this day of siege. I will save the tents of Judah first in order that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not be magnified above Judah. Who's going to get to be the preeminent party here or personages in verse 7? It's going to be those of this. The tents of Judah are going to have more glory than the inhabitants of Jerusalem and all those others. So those who don't become part of this new kingdom, they're not going to receive the glory when all this is said and done. Their glory is going to be gone or diminished less than those of the church. And did we not see that in AD 70? By AD 70, where's the church? Is it all still in Jerusalem? It's all over the Roman Empire by that time, isn't it? And we even know that from secular history. We know that. Where are the Jews in 70 AD? The physical nation of Judaism.
It's gone.
Obliterated as a nation, and they're scattered. It's illegal for them to even live in Palestine anymore, and they become the bane of Europe. Dude, that's where it started. And they're scattered all over. And they have no nth degree of the glory that they once had. Because what was their glory based on? Jerusalem and the temple and being the covenant people of God. Do they have any of that left after 70 AD? They have none of that. The glory of spiritual Jerusalem, though, is going to be greater, verse 7. Verses 8 and 9, how are we going to defend the spiritual Jerusalem in this day of siege when it happens? We look at verses 8 and 9. Look at verse 9. It will come about in that day that I will set about to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And I will pour out on the house of David, on the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and supplication. Again, this idea of spiritual Jerusalem and the blessings that these people would get if they would turn to it and accept the blessings of Christianity. They're going to receive this grace and supplication, the spirit of grace and supplication, verse 10. And so, which kingdom in chapter 12 would you really want to be a part of if you're in Jerusalem? Neither one's, it's not going to be a pleasant time. I mean, Jerusalem's under siege by the Roman army. Not a happy thought. But if you had to be in one party or the other, would you rather be hanging on to the vestiges of physical Jerusalem or be in this new spiritual kingdom that's being described by Zechariah? You see the tipping point of why 70 AD is so important? Because it is a tipping point in my estimation. Now, when did this really all start? 70 AD is the climax of when it happened, but what set everything in place for this to happen?
What do you mean for the
The
seed?
crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the rejection of the shepherd king set all this into motion. Did it happen overnight? No, it didn't. You know, when did the church begin? When Jesus died on the cross and became its king? How about 40 days or days later when he ascended and sat down on his throne in heaven next to his Father? Did the kingdom begin when the king took his throne? Pentecost hadn't happened yet. Or did it happen on the day of Pentecost? In our mind, we want to say exactly when it happened, but in God's mind, 70 AD, the crucifixion of Christ, the rejection of the shepherd king, my son returning to his heavenly throne to sit next to me. This is all in the eyes of God. It's the same. It's that same moment. It's for the same reasons. Okay. We try to put a time date stamp on it, and you can't. You just can't. Now, I still say, you know, when did the church begin? If I want to give you the short answer, I'll say day of Pentecost. Because we have scriptural verses that point to the church did not exist before that. And then we have passages that refer to the church existing from that point forward. So when I look at all those passages, I put together, well, looks to me like it happened when people started obeying the shepherd king and doing his commandments and following him in faith and baptism. And they were added to the church, such as should be saved. That I know I can put my finger on. So that's why I say the day of Pentecost, right? And it fulfills scripture too. Old Testament scripture, right? Joel 2, Daniel 2, right? About the Holy Spirit coming down upon the apostles. When did that happen? Day of Pentecost. But there are a number of things that had to happen for all of this to be put into play. And so AD 70 is very important for those reasons. And in verses 10 through 14, in the finishing up of chapter 12, we see this extension of grace to physical Jerusalem in the day of siege. Now, why did they get grace? Why did Jerusalem get any grace at all? Who's still in Jerusalem, physical Jerusalem? Some of the Christians, right? Not everybody scattered in the persecutions in the early chapters of Acts. The apostles in and of themselves, right? I don't know when all the apostles died, but some of them certainly could have still been in Jerusalem and alive in 70 AD. It's kind of like Rahab in the fall of Jericho, right? Was Rahab given time to get out? She was spared. This similar thing, I think, is kind of what's it's like this extension of grace to physical Jerusalem was to give time for those who would see the signs, who would see this abomination of desolation, who would see much of what we read in Matthew chapter 24. And I had to go there at some point with this discussion. Read Matthew chapter 24 and read this chapter 12 in Zechariah, and you will see how well it fits together. Right? When the Romans came, did they just throw a nuclear bomb over the wall and take Jerusalem in about 32 seconds? You realize it took a year. A year. They built a siege ramp to conquer the walls of Jerusalem, right? Later on, they did it at Megiddo and several other holdout places, right? Not Megiddo, Masada, and several other places. A couple of years after, 72 AD, I think was Masada. Right? Took them 2 more years to capture that one fortress of the holdouts. But in Jerusalem at that time, we're faithful people. And God is giving them a period of grace and a set number of signs to look for. When you see this happening, you need to go. You need to go. Kind of reminds you of Lot, the day of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Get your things. We need to go. How about if we leave in the morning? No, go. And the angels grabbed them by the hand and drew them out of the city, didn't they? So, some thoughts along those lines. That's chapter 12. Thoughts or comments on that, and then we'll jump into 13. They kind of go together. Let's look at 13. In the first two verses, you've got that phrase again, in that day, verses 1 and 2. But in verses 2 through 6, what is one of the things that's going to happen in that day? Some other signs that the people could look for.
Those who prophesy.
Number one, in verse 1, a fountain will be open. In verse 2, the names of the idols of the land will no longer be remembered, and I will also remove what? The prophets as well as the unclean spirit from the land. What's the unclean spirit or spirits? Demons? Probably. I don't have an issue with that understanding of that. Makes sense, right? You take away, there's going to come a time where miracles will cease. Prophecies will cease. Demonic, unclean spirits in the land will cease. When's that going to happen? In that day. When is that day? Well, it hadn't changed because we changed chapters. It's still the same context, right? In that day, 70 AD, roughly, right? Again, God looks at AD 33 and AD 70 as the same tipping point events where things are changing. The spiritual kingdom is being established and growing. Physical Jerusalem and the nation of Judaism is waning and going to be destroyed. And all that takes a little time for it all to roll out, right? And so that's how I understand that. If you look at 13:1, this fountain to be opened in the house of David, and look at this for what? For the inhabitants of Jerusalem, but why? The fountain is going to be opened. Why? And what's it going to do for the people?
Cleanse their sin.
For sin and for impurity. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 5. And from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth, to him who loves us and released us from what? From our sins by his blood. Where'd that happen?
Cross.
It happened in Jerusalem. Happened at the cross, happened in Jerusalem. This place is under discussion. So there's going to be a fountain opened in that day in Jerusalem for the inhabitants of the Jerusalem. It's going, that blood and that fountain is going to open there, and it's going to start to flow from within that city to go to the entire world. And why? For sin and impurity. Pretty impressive, isn't it? Okay. I just wanted to bring Revelation in because Revelation does rely some on Zechariah's metaphors and his illustrations as well. Pete?
Yeah, on this, where the prophecy is going to cease, you can see this taking place in 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, the 8th verse. It says, none will fail, but whether there are prophecies, they will fail.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yep.
gonna happen.
And if you look at the time date stamp of about when 1 Corinthians was written, late 60s, a few years before fall of Jerusalem, I think, give or take, maybe late 50s even. But yeah, it's going to soon come about, right? In that generation, they're going to see that happen. Zechariah is talking about it centuries before, right? Okay, verses 7 through 9. What else is going to be part of this? They're going to do what in verse 7? They're going to strike the shepherd that the sheep may be scattered. These people are going to reject the shepherd king and his sheep, his afflicted flock is what's described. It's described in chapter 11 as and 10. This afflicted flock, the sheep are going to be scattered, and I will turn my hand against these little ones, these people that are doing this in God's eyes. And he says, because you have stricken my shepherd. Now I want you to note John chapter 10. In John chapter 10 and verse 11, there's a little bit of a connection here. In John chapter 10 and verse 11, this is about the parable of the Good Shepherd. Jesus says this about himself. I am the Good Shepherd. Should there be anybody in Jerusalem who doesn't think Jesus is claiming to be the Shepherd King? He told them right here, I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd does what? Lays down his life for the sheep. What does Zechariah say? The shepherd's going to be stricken, but the sheep may be scattered. He's going to lay down his life for his sheep. It all comes together, I think, folks. And if you look at Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 11, the humility of Jesus in all of this, I think it's an element we need to consider. I thought it would make interesting to add that. Hebrews 2 and verse 11. You know, the power of the shepherd king, he's the son of God. He is the creator of man. And in 2:11, we see, for both he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are all from one Father, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them what? Brethren. You see, through all of this, the humility of Jesus in undergoing what all he went through is fulfillment of everything Zechariah is telling them is going to happen. And why is he doing it? Because he and the Father and the Spirit are all one in Hebrews chapter 2. And then he makes that point. They're all one. This is one purpose. What Jesus did was his role within that. Who?
It kind of ties in with Larry's class Wednesday night. Fulfilling when Jesus died, it fulfilled.
Yeah, I came to fulfill the covenant.
And that
right?
Constantly, the whole thing when he died on that cross.
That's right.
So
It all
ties everything together.
it's all connected. It's one tapestry, folks. You can't just pull out strings of fabric and not change the picture. See the whole tapestry. Okay. All right, this gets us into chapter 14. Let's hang on to this for just a second. Anything else on chapter 12 or chapter 13? This idea of prophecy will cease during this time period forever. It's something we really need to grip and grasp, because do people think, have you ever heard anybody say miracles happen today? Well, if you think miracles happen today and prophecies are fulfilled today, then you have to make a different understanding of what Zechariah says about in that day. Because in that day can't be 70 AD. Because that was 1965 years ago. Right? So if in that day is the destruction of physical Jerusalem and the rejection of God of Israel in the physical sense, for the predominance of the spiritual kingdom to begin, just like Daniel chapter 2 prophesied, then you can't say in that day is then, if you say miracles still happen today, because Zechariah says miracles and prophecies and unclean spirits are all going to end. In that day, they're going to end. The only other way you got to do that is say, well, in that day started in AD 33, and that in that day is still going on even now. And I would say, okay, so show me the Jews. Show me God's protection of the Jewish nation. Show me the temple. Show me the Jerusalem that the remnant rebuilt. You can't. You can't even tell me a Jew's a Jew. Can't prove it. Where's the paperwork? They used to have it. They have it by lineage. I mean, I kind of know my lineage is from my parents and the hand-me-downs of where we came from. But you know what? That gets me back about 5 generations. I have no idea about the 10 generations or the 20 generations before that, where my family came from. I have no clue. I can guess. But that's all it is a guess. Culturally, I can say, oh, well, I align with these people in my heritage. I align with them. That doesn't mean I'm from their DNA. Doesn't. Can't prove it. Jews could prove it. Paul could prove it. You can't today. Why? Because it was all destroyed in 70 AD. All of that was done away with. Where's the sacrificial system today? How many lambs were killed last Saturday in Jerusalem in worship in Judaism? Quick answer, 0. Why? Because even they know it's not there. So if you say in that day is still just an eon of time, and it includes today until Jesus Christ comes again, for a period of tribulation and so forth, then the Jewish system should still be in force and visible. And it is not. You've got problems if you take that position. So I think the in that day and being the AD 70 and the destruction of the sacrificial system and the Jewish system makes sense in context, and it makes sense with all other prophecies, and it's consistent with what we read here. Thoughts on that, Larry?
I may be throwing out something crazy, so this is just as I'm trying to.
Well, then you can answer it Wednesday in your class.
Yeah, yeah. Chapter 11, without question, it, deals with the 87 destruction of Jerusalem. I'm wondering if there is the possibility of looking at chapter 12 as maybe the persecution found in the book of Revelation with Roman Empire, where you have spiritual battle. I'm just throwing out a possibility. It's one of those things.
And so this chapter here, I'll set up my pedestal and kick it over. Zechariah 12 helps me understand Revelation is applicable to 70 AD. It's a very good chapter to use if I want to take the position that everything in Revelation applied to 70 AD also, and take an early date for the writing of Revelation, not a latter date. And there's a lot of good fellows that I know that take that position. Okay, Fred Newman is one of them. He's taught Revelation in this congregation, and he believes in the early date, and that everything in Revelation that John is describing them is going to occur in 70 AD. And I don't take that position. I take the position that John wrote that in the late 90s, and that the imagery and so forth and the emphasis in Revelation is not concerned with the Jewish people. They're long gone. What he's concerned with in Revelation is that final understanding that the church, the replacement of the Judaism in the eyes of the beloved people of God, Christianity is going to overcome the Roman Empire and its oppression, not the issues with Judaism and the Roman Empire. That's where I have big problems in Revelation trying to take the early date when I keep trying to make Rome and Jews fighting, when the real emphasis is about the church. Right? It's not the 7 synagogues of Asia. It's the 7 churches of Asia in the first 3 chapters of Revelation. So the emphasis is on the church combating Caesar and the Roman Empire, and all the imagery I think we're going to see in the Revelation involves that. People who take the early date have to struggle with that issue. But this chapter, I'll concede, does point very consistently with some things you see in Revelation. There are certain chapters in Revelation that point very strongly at Jerusalem. But again, my answer to that is, well, the church was in Jerusalem prior to 70 AD. The church was there at 70 AD. I think there was a church in Jerusalem. Very likely there were still apostles there, and they were told to flee. So it's not that it's ignored in the book. It's not the emphasis.
But the book was the Revelation, and if John was on the island of Patmos in the 90s, AD, how could that be a revelation? You know what I'm saying?
Well,
You know
if
what I'm
you
saying?
take
If
the
you
latter
just-
date, it can't have to do with 70 AD because that happened 27 or
yeah.
30 years before.
So then how can you take that? Well, we're not studying Revelation.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah.
Come to the Bible read. We're actually going to get there in a couple weeks. That's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Travis?
Let me add something else I think is important in this discussion. Given if Revelation had been written in the 90s, then that certainly would not have applied to something that happened 20 years early in a prophetic sense, because there wouldn't be any prediction about it.
Yeah, that's right.
And of course, this is a long-standing debate among many scholars and Christians, not just a debate within the churches of Christ as far as,
Right.
when that book was written. The point I want to make is if the exact timing of the writing of that book really mattered, there should be something organic to the text, the inspired text, which places that in a particular timeline or setting.
Mhm.
To my knowledge, that's not there. And that signals to me that, these extra biblical pieces of information to try to date that text is not the point of the book. And I think that's important for us to remember.
Well, I would say this to you, Travis, you can think about it, because everyone said that depending on whichever position you take on Revelation, if you take the early date, I've heard most of the fellows take the early date, they go into some of the symbology, try to strengthen their point. And to me, when you start trying to put names on horns, the 10 horns, and try to name the Caesars that match up to the 10 horns, I think you start missing the forest for the trees, and you're just naming species of trees. And you miss the whole point of what does the 10 horns represent. Right?
I would agree with that.
And so I would say that they would say that there are indications in the passage in the book that we could look at that kind of gives us a time date stamp. Because if I can name the 10 horns, but I don't include Julius Caesar, that means it's after Julius Caesar lived, because all the horns are going to come in the future.
Okay.
So we're kind of way down a tangent here, but the point is, what is in Zechariah 12 is extremely important to the Jew to understand that they are not going to be the favored people for God forever, like they were from the time of Abraham's covenant onward. Because God is going to break that staff. He's going to break that covenant because they've already broken it. They have broken it. He's taking his staff that represents that to him and breaking his staff. He didn't break their staff. He broke his own staff that represented that union and that bond of him to the Jewish people. He breaks that in chapter 11. Okay. All right. I wanted to finish that, maybe give that a little more time to talk about. And we're going to do 14 and finish the book next week, because when I looked at 14, I was like, there's no way we can get through all three of these chapters. 14 is a huge chapter. Okay. It's importance, but it's about the final judgment of God's covenant people. In Zechariah's words, the final judgment of the Jewish nation is in this chapter. And there's a lot here. And there's a lot here for application for us to look at for ourselves as well. Because God does not change. He is just and righteous and holy. And what he has done, we can learn from. Okay, so we're going to look at chapter 14 next week, finish this book, and then move on into Haggai and Malachi. And we will have studied all the Old Testament texts that deal with the Jewish people in the preparation for Christ. Taking us almost a year to do this.